Lawmakers can't agree on a starting point for the state budget or whether or not the state needs a new construction plan. That's up next on Capitol View. Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn from Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today are Ben Yount from Illinois Statehouse News. Ben, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me back.
Charlie Wheeler, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield and a longtime Statehouse reporter himself. Charlie, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Jamey.
And Dave Dahl, Statehouse reporter with Illinois Radio Network.
Still, yes.
Yes. Thanks for coming, Dave.
Thank you.
All right. Well, today we're looking at budget numbers. Several different budget numbers are floating around the Capitol right now as far as the projections of what we will have to spend on the upcoming budget. There's some pretty big discrepancies on those numbers. Ben, I know you've been talking to some folks about that this week. Would you like to walk us through it?
Well, the state may or may not have $1 billion or $2 or maybe even a little bit more than that extra than what at least one caucus says they have to spend. You're looking at 4 revenue projections and then the governor's spending number. The lowest, I believe, is the House number, which is 33.2. The governor's budget, his revenue projections are a little bit higher than that. I want to say 33.9 or 33.8. COGFA's at 34 and some change, and the Senate Democrats have theirs at 34.2, $1 billion higher than the House. Now, there's complaints that COGFA's numbers are even a little low. They may be $1 billion off. So what does it mean? Everybody's talking about possibly a budget that's anywhere between $33 and $36 billion. Governor Quinn's spending plan came out to about 35.4. Now, we could see a budget that could be anything. Nobody knows. These budgets are just projections. It's only March. They're going on spring break. They're going to come back in April. At the end of April, we'll start to get to May, and everyone will start to figure out exactly what it's going to be. But it's tough to start to say what the budget is when you don't know what it could be. And if lawmakers are looking at billions in cuts, well, if we have an extra $2 billion on the table somewhere, why do we need to cut from me? Let's cut from somebody else, or let's not cut at all.
So that seems to be the difference, taking the possibility of taking pressure off of cuts, or in the House, they seem to be pretty adamant that, hey, we're going to stick with this number, no crying to us, this is what we have.
The talking point last week was, we're the House, this is our revenue projection, we're going to tell appropriation committees what they have to spend. The talking point this week is, this is a bicameral legislature, where the House and the Senate have to get, so I think everybody understands that these are projections, these are starting points, and where we end up May 31st could be close, or it could be someplace that we don't even know yet. It may go higher.
Charlie, how does this...
And this year it's different, and these numbers are more significant than they've been in the past, because under the new budgeting process that was approved last year, and under one component of the tax increase, the legislature has to lay out a number and has to have its spending fit underneath that number, or else the tax increase goes away. There's a procedure whereby the Auditor General will review the spending plans, review the revenue likely to be there and other resources, and if the spending plan exceeds the revenue, then the tax increase automatically sunsets. So it's a lot more significant than it's been in past years, where, as Ben said, people are just kind of throwing numbers around and, well, so what?
Has there always been, or typically been, this kind of bickering of where we start from, of the starting point, though?
Not really, not in the sense of having different numbers between the Senate and the House, where there's a formal process in which both chambers will approve resolutions saying this is what we think the number is. Historically, the governor's budget office has come out with a number. The legislative fiscal forecasting agency, nowadays called the Commission on Government Finance and Accountability, will come out with a number. Sometimes they're really close, sometimes they're a little further apart. There was one occasion several decades ago when the governor and the Democratic legislative majorities couldn't agree, and they decided, well, we'll just jack the revenue estimate by $50 million, and then we can cover the spending we want to do. But it's a lot tighter process this time around because of these reforms that have been made in the budgeting procedure itself.
You're also not going to have what the legislature's done for the past 2 years, and maybe even 3, just throw a lump sum at Governor Pat Quinn and say, it's your problem now, you go and deal with it. There does have to be a bit more line by line and
right.
accountability.
And that was another one of these reforms. They can no longer do that kind of lump sum stuff.
And meanwhile, the parade of department heads through the committee hearing rooms and social service groups through the Blue Room and the Capitol Press Room, the wants and needs don't go away. No one's saying that.
And that's going to be one of the problems that these guys have. If you've got 4 different revenue projections that vary over $2 billion, well, that's $2 billion. That could stave off some cuts. The governor had talked about a $500 million cut from human services for FY11, the current budget. Then it got revised down to 200 something. Now I guess the latest number is 57 million. Well, if we've got $2 billion, why do we need to take that $57 million hit this year or even next year? And then you have the Republicans in the Senate who came out and said, well, no, we can cut $5 billion from the state budget. It really gets confusing, and it's too early for it to be this confusing.
Well, and they're saying not only can we have to cut between $4 and $5 billion from the budget.
The Centers for Independent Living, for example, were in the Blue Room saying, don't cut our programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, then what should they cut, or how else could they raise revenue? And the person in charge of it said, I get that question a lot. And it's really the job of the legislature to figure that out.
Well, and it's going to be a tough sell to local school districts who we've talked to plenty who say, you're going to force us to consolidate, allegedly, Governor Quinn. Then you're going to cut in half the amount of money you want to pay so our school buses can run, in some cases, all over the county. If there's $2 billion extra, or even $1 billion, or even $500 million, schools back home, where a lot of people get their information to vote, are going to be crying poor. And in a year where this is all about the fallout of the income tax increase, I think you're going to have some gun-shy legislators who don't want to not spend money. They don't want to leave money on the table. If they can spend it and still get in under the spending cap, they're going to want to spend it. And I haven't been at the Capitol. I've been watching the Capitol as long as you, Charlie, but I've never seen lawmakers voluntarily leave money on the table.
Well, Charlie,
That's
I'd like
true.
to focus a little bit more on these Republican budget cuts. This is the first time they've come forward with specific cuts. They're not line item cuts, but they are making some suggestions of, from human services, we would like to see this amount. Here's
Right.
where it could come from.
I
What did
would
you
say
make of
this is
Charlie?
the first time that they've been serious, in my judgment, and I commend them for it. Before, it's always this, well, we'll cut all this nebulous waste and fraud that's out there. And now they've realized that if you want to make cuts to this magnitude, and they identified roughly, I think, $6.7 billion worth of programs and services that they say should be done away with. And they're real numbers, and the math is there. And to me, it also illustrates how very difficult it is, as you guys were saying, because you look at the specifics, they would cut human services roughly $2 billion, the biggest chunk out of that being Medicaid, and they would do it in Medicaid by saying, okay, we will provide fewer services, or we will provide services to fewer people. We'll reduce the eligibility rolls so that less people qualify for services, less people get money. Some of the other human service agencies, they said, we'll provide fewer services and we'll pay the people who provide them less. Now, those aren't going to be popular ideas, but mathematically they're realistic in terms that that's what you have to do. Or you look at education. They suggested cutting between elementary and secondary and higher education, cutting like $1 billion. They said, for example, we don't really need to give so much money to school districts that have high levels of low-income kids. Now, if you're a Republican senator from a very wealthy district, you don't really have to worry about educating low-income kids the same way you do as if you're a senator from a district in the south suburbs where the income levels are really low. And they want to cut higher education by about $200 million. So these are real cuts, and as I say, I give them credit for laying them out there. This is, they say, we will put 15 votes on this package of cuts. And so now it's up to the Democrats, and to respond.
Speaking of that, we keep hearing about the president's salary, the president of the U of I. When are you going to do something about that, Charlie?
Well, those cuts, they may have real numbers and the math may add up, but there are going to be problems in that. To cut $2 billion from Medicaid, we may be boxed in Illinois, as in other states, when the new federal health care laws take effect. There are provisions in there that say you can't roll back eligibility and kick people off. The state may not only be stuck with the people who are eligible now who have traditionally been eligible, but may be stuck with the Blagojevich expansions that really cost a lot of money. And Julie Hamos was in a committee just this week talking about how the most costly set of people on Medicaid are the elderly and the disabled, but the largest chunk are children. So if you're a Republican senator and you have to go home, you're going to kick off grandma or you're going to kick off the kids. And we want to cut $1 billion from education. In the FY12 spending breakdown that the House just released, they're going to spend about $9 billion on K through 12 education. That's 27% of what they say they're going to spend. So you're going to cut 1/9 of the money going to schools. It's going to be a tough pill to swallow. The math does add up, and the way the Republicans put that $22 billion deficit 5 years down the road, that really works if you run through the math. Getting from point A to point B, I think that is going to be really, and state government would look very, 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 very different next year if you take $5 to $6 billion out of it.
Yeah, I felt that way too, that the math really added up, but the logic on not every piece of it added up. The school consolidation, there's been reports now that could actually cost us more because districts would have to pay higher wages to teachers that came over from a lower paid school. One of the things that they targeted was tuition waivers, which that's always a popular target that the General Assembly gives out, tuition waivers. But a lot of those tuition waivers go to students who are working for the school to earn that tuition waiver. It might cost more for colleges and universities to hire folks to fill in those positions. So some of the logistics of it are not completely
Well, and
clear.
another big chunk was they wanted to save in excess of $1 billion by changing the rules for pensions and saying that people in the system now will get fewer benefits when they retire, maybe have to work longer than currently. They didn't delineate all the changes, but they suggested that we can save $1.3 billion if we impose some of these reforms on pensions. I'm one who would be affected by this, so I sense I have a conflict of interest. Because
I do too.
I wish I was so lucky.
Well, because at some point I may choose to retire. But on the other hand, I've read the brief that was filed by the Senate Democratic Legal Counsel, Eric Madeir, and it's pretty compelling in terms of going back, looking at the transcripts from the Constitutional Convention, looking at the correspondence between the delegate who sponsored the provision that guarantees these pension rights, looking at the requests from legislators that he read into the record a statement interpreting this section in a way that would allow the legislature to later change the benefits, which he refused to do. And it's pretty clear. It says what it says and it means what it means. Now you can go through the exercise of passing legislation and having it go to the courts and having it thrown out and you'll feel good about it. But I don't think there's a snowball's chance that changing the benefit structure for people in the system will survive a constitutional court test.
There are also going to be problems if you want to move, and I was having this conversation on the floor with a number of GOP senators, if you say, all right, anybody who's in the system now, we can't touch you, that's fine. Let's take it even further for new hires and get rid of defined benefit and move to a defined contribution. You've got the problem of Social Security for teachers. So if the exercise is let's save the state money and you make these changes, well, the state is still going to have to pay, and you may go through all of the process and really not save all that much money. And yeah, pensions they may not be popular, but I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon, just because it's going to be costly and difficult to change, and the savings aren't tangible. You can't say, if you do X, you will get Y.
How much of this is trying to bring some common sense to the system, and how much of it is, as some of the folks in other states have been accused of doing, just beating up on public employees?
Well, I don't think that in Illinois we have the same level of antipathy towards public workers as apparently the majority of Republicans and the governor of Wisconsin have. I don't think even within the Republican caucus, I think there are a few Republican lawmakers who would want to ban collective bargaining for public employees. Illinois has a long, rich tradition of being a labor state, a state where the working man was valued. And it was through, what would you say, men and women in the 19th century who lobbied to start unions to protect working men that we have some of the benefits that we have. And again, I have a conflict of interest. I've mentioned this before. I'm a lifetime member of the Chicago Newspaper Guild, which is a reporters union. So, but I don't think we're going to see that kind of hostility in Illinois. For starters, somebody who has that mindset can't get elected in Illinois.
Yeah, I think that the difference, and we wrote a little bit about this, about how Illinois was able to move through massive pension reform essentially in a day because Speaker Madigan decreed that it was going to happen. How that moved, and it was opposed just as fiercely by the unions, but it happened and there wasn't this, breakdown of civil society at the Capitol. And I think that it really comes down to the politics of Illinois, and that the politics are, the politics of victory and the politics of cooperation. That was something that the Speaker said all the time about Rod Blagojevich. His were the politics of division and not the politics of compromise. And that I think that Scott Walker up in Wisconsin has no problem saying, you and me, we're going to go fight, and let's go outside and do it. And he likes the way that ends, and that was very Blagojevichian. Rod loved to do that. There always had to be something.
And part of it is when we did our pension reforms, it was being done out of a need to address the ongoing problem with the unfunded liability. Over time, this will reduce our unfunded liability. It was never any thought of doing away with collective bargaining rights. Whereas in Wisconsin, even after the public employees unions agreed to pay more for their pensions, to take cuts in benefits, the governor still decided he wanted to eliminate collective bargaining and basically wipe out union rights for public workers, except police and fire.
Well, I'd like to move on and talk a little bit about the attempted cigarette tax increase that came up this week. It was Senate President John Cullerton has backed $1 a pack cigarette tax increase for quite a few years now. He's presented it as a revenue solution for a lot of different problems, and now he's presenting it as a way to pay for the Capitol construction plan. Video poker was one of the big funding mechanisms for that, and it isn't really panning out in the state, so legislators are looking for a new way to pay for the plan. And at the same time, the plan is under some legal question. It's in front of the Supreme Court now, and they could rule it unconstitutional. Is this premature? Are we ready to start reworking a capital bill before the court even decides?
Well, the Senate isn't ready to vote on it, that's for sure. Cullerton was able to get it out of committee, but they, after giving kind of a head fake, never called it for a vote. They don't have the votes, at least right now, maybe after the break.
I think some of this goes to the politics of the video poker. I don't know. Video poker's been a mess since the day it was passed, and I don't know if anybody ever actually expects to get any money quickly from it. Democrats in Illinois have to do a lot of image makeover if they want to get reelected in a couple of years. You don't vote for a 67% income tax increase and get to walk back home and say, yeah, there are going to be a lot of angry voters. And so I think some of these maneuvers that you've seen during this session are aimed at trying to deflect any future election blows that these Democrats are going to face for that tax increase. Is the cigarette tax going to happen now? I mean, eventually, yeah, eventually. John Cullerton will find a way. He's the president of the Illinois Senate. He does not like cigarettes. Fine. Illinois will raise the price of a pack of cigarettes $1 some way, somehow, somewhere for something. There are lots of people who want that money. The Black Caucus in the House says all that money should go to education. There's $300 million to help pay for some of the poorest schools. The politics of the vote, not going to happen. It's a lot of talk. It's like gaming, that you see it come up every year whenever there's a talk about the budget because, oh, here's a pile of free money just waiting for us to get it. All we have to do is pass this. And then in between that conversation and a vote, oh, and let's do this, and let's do that, and let's do this, and let's do this, and let's send this here, and it all falls apart.
An interesting thing is that Senator Cullerton was kind enough to come and have a news conference with my PAR students this past fall. It was, I don't know, maybe a month or so before the election. And at that time, he suggested that because there was a lot of hue and cry, a lot of people concerned about video gaming, for moral reasons or for economic reasons. They did not want to see this video gaming instituted. And he, at that time, to my students, he suggested, well, maybe one of the things we can do is look at the cigarette tax increase. It would raise roughly the same amount of money as video gaming, and it wouldn't carry with it this baggage in terms of leading people astray and you know, the problem gamblers throwing their paycheck into the slot machine, that kind of thing.
Was that on the record, and do you have tape of that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. Yeah, and it was totally on the record, and students wrote stories about it. So,
Yeah, instead of
he didn't do it just for us. I mean, he was saying that pretty consistently.
Yeah.
And as Ben said, John Cullerton has been a long-time proponent of limiting smoking. He was one of the key sponsors of the smoking ban. He not of the one that finally passed, but through the years he sponsored. And another time he spoke to a class, and this was probably 6-8 years ago. And at the time, he predicted the smoking ban would pass because the Surgeon General had just come out and said that secondhand smoke is a health hazard. And sure enough, the next session it did. So his stance on cigarettes, as Ben was saying, it's nothing new. That's long term for him.
It seems that part of this push may be to get Republicans to actually, as you said, Ben, for the election to actually speak up and say that they support video poker. Some of them voted for it, but in general, a lot of Republicans have been pretty vocally opposed to it because it's not wanted in the suburbs. And they definitely did speak up and defend it in some ways when this bill came up.
so many places have opted out of the video poker even before it's begun. It's hard to imagine that bringing in, you know, anywhere near the kind of money they want to. And then I wonder how many people have a problem with the financial foundation of the state, so much of it resting on gambling and smoking.
Well, those are easy taxes to pass.
Yeah.
Just look at the vote on the income tax and look at the vote on video poker or even the last vote on a cigarette tax. I don't smoke, so those people should pay more. I don't gamble, so those people should pay more. I don't drink a lot of liquor, so those people should pay more. I go to work. I don't want to pay more. Well, I mean, I do gamble and
On
drink.
most of those, that is a
But see,
hypothetical for
I
I
don't
guess,
smoke.
I don't know, I guess
Yeah.
maybe I'll sound cynical, but it strikes me that we have video gaming right now, and a lot of it is controlled by the mob. So why shouldn't the state get in, squeeze the mob out, as we did with the numbers racket when we went to
lottery.
the daily lottery,
1974.
and tax it, yeah.
Well, that was Minority Leader Christine Radonio's argument was, we've already told these folks we're going to do this. If they had an illegal operation, they got rid of it because if you were caught with one, then you didn't get to get on the legal side of it. So now they've gotten rid of this revenue source that everyone kind of knew they already had,
Yeah,
and they're waiting for the state to do what they said they were going to do.
You guys can correct me if my memory is faulty on this, but wasn't House Minority Leader Tom Cross one of the leading people arguing that we should do this, you know, legalize what's going on anyway to help pay for the capital
One of the
plan?
people that I always talk, one of the lawmakers I always talk to, whenever we do anything on video gaming, is John O. Jones, Mount Vernon area state senator, Republican. He has a truck stop there at the nexus of two interstates. I've filled up there on my way to Florida. They have back room that used to have just regular video game machines for kids cleared out waiting for video poker because they know that they'll get people traveling through, or even people who are there in town go in, plunk in a couple of dollars, see if they can make some money back. I played video blackjack when I was in Las Vegas, and I took $10 from the house. So it's and the world didn't decay. I went on and did a little better at the tables, but there are people who are waiting for this. There are people who want it. There are people who expect it. It's going to be a different situation in the suburbs where there are a lot of those, one community, border one community, and some of those places have opted out, but there's always going to be a hole in the donut. The state just needs to figure out how to do it and move forward. You're either going to do it or you're not.
See, and I would argue that there's been a lot of publicity given to those localities that have opted out, but I bet you there's not more than 100 of them statewide.
No, and some of them are
And there
very
are
little
100, and there are
municipalities.
102 counties, and there's something like 1,200 cities and villages and municipalities. So if you figure you got 1,300 and maybe 100 opted out, that's still 1,200 that are going to have it.
Well, I'd like to finish up talking about a nomination that came forward, was supposed to come forward this week and did not. Dave, I think you were covering this. It was some controversy with Quinn and some allegations of maybe pay to play.
Well, it certainly looked bad, and one thing that you see around the Capitol a lot is sometimes things are bad simply because they look bad. Corinne Gordon, who was one of the lame ducks, who was a Democrat lawmaker from Coal City area, Morris, voted in favor of the tax increase on the last night of the session after campaigning against a tax increase and after losing. And as a side note, the lady she lost to never served in the House and wound up taking an open seat in the Senate. Senator Gary, no relation, Dahl. But Ms. Gordon, shortly after casting the vote and leaving the legislature, wound up being appointed to the Prisoner Review Board. And the timing was just terrible. And she was supposed to be the subject of the confirmation hearing in Senate committee this week. And I believe it was just one day before it was supposed to happen, we got a note that she had withdrawn.
14 hours before. She was due in the morning, and the word came down about 6 o'clock at night the evening before. Pat Quinn either has a very, very low political IQ or the absolute worst timing in the world. And you've seen this with stories.
Is that an and or is
Well, it may be both. I mean, it may not be a multiple choice question. You see this when you know, on the day of his budget, it comes out a couple of months later that he was handing out raises. He just can't get away from these fumbles. And this, Corinne Gordon, I don't think I talked to anybody who said she's not qualified for the job. You just can't do that. It doesn't look good. And Dave, you're right. It doesn't matter if it is good. If it doesn't look, it's why they don't make green ketchup anymore. It didn't look good. And so people aren't, it doesn't pass the
And
smell
by the
test.
way, these are full-time jobs. And they pay more than $80,000 a year. It's not an honorific thing. It is a full-time job being on the Prisoner Review Board.
$86,000, I think she would have made more than she did as a lawmaker. She lost, voted for a tax increase, and got a raise.
We'll have to end on that note. Thank you for tuning in this week. I'd like to thank my guests, Ben Yount, Charlie Wheeler, and Dave Dahl. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn from Illinois Issues Magazine, and tune in next week for more updates on Capitol View.